Right, we shall get going. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. My name is Barry Coombs. I'm Chief Technologist here at Computer World. Today, we're going to be talking all about Azure Virtual Desktop, a technology that we have seen go from strength to strength, certainly over the last 2 years. Obviously, lots of stuff has changed in terms of the way that we're working, collaborating. So it's important to be reviewing the technology and looking at it. And lots of customers are on that cloud journey as well, so it fits in well with that. So today I'm joined with Tom Button from our partners Inti, who is going to take the lead on today's presentation. Tom works very closely with the pre-sales and architecture teams at Computer World. So Tom, do you want to just do a bit of an overview of yourself, first of all, what your role is, what your experience is, and then I'll pass over to you to lead the presentation. If anyone does have any questions during the presentation, please pop it in the chat. Equally, thoughts and reactions. It's good to hear from those of you that are on the time. Over to you today, Tom.
Cool, thank you, Barry. So so my name's Tom Button. Good to kind of virtually meet you all, I guess. I am a senior Azure pre-sales engineer, so I work for Inti. We are a indirect CSP provider and partner of Computer World, as Barry already alluded to. I'm also a certified Azure Virtual Desktop specialist as well. So hopefully the content I deliver to you today is up to scratch. As Barry's already alluded to, if you have any questions at all, just put them in the questions box and I will be more than willing to answer as many as I can at the end. What I typically do as well is take away the questions, do a write-up, and then send that out to every single attendee as well. So if we don't get around to answering all of the questions, or there are some questions which maybe need a bit of research and digging further after, we will respond to all of them as well. So yeah, don't worry at all. So what are we going to talk about today? So the agenda for today is fairly simple, although we are going to go into a bit more detail than what's on screen here. There's not just 4 slides, don't worry. So we'll talk about a forever evolving market and Azure Virtual Desktop and where it sits in the marketplace. We'll cover VDI generally as well. We'll then talk about what Azure Virtual Desktop is, so what it is as a product, again, where it sits in the market, and then we'll talk about why you should use it. So the benefits of it commercially, the benefits of it for your users, and the technical benefits as well. And then we'll focus on getting started and key considerations. Okay, so there's much more than just going into an Azure subscription and deploying Azure Virtual Desktop. There's a number of considerations as part of that kind of planning stage, which you need to be aware of before you start deploying any production or releasing any production workloads. So we'll cover all of that today and give you some pointers in the right direction. Okay, and yeah, again, if anything that we speak about is of interest today, reach out to Computer World and they'll be more than happy to help. Either they can answer the questions themselves or they can reach out to me and my team and we can assist on that front as well. So yeah, anything of interest, make a note, let the guys know, and we'll come back to you in due course. Okay, so virtual desktop infrastructure, so VDI generally. So if we place Azure Virtual Desktop to the side for a moment, let's take a step back and just touch on VDI generally as a solution. So as I'm sure the majority of you know, delivering desktops virtually is nothing new. It's a pretty mature solution now in the IT world, and for good reason as well. It's quickly become the go-to solution for businesses of any size, really, especially during the world that we now live in with COVID-19, for not only deploying desktops, but also enabling workforces to work from pretty much anywhere on any device. But for those organizations that have specialized workloads, are security conscious, and so much more as well. Now, whilst VDI in itself isn't necessarily new, we've got Horizon, Citrix, and so on. Microsoft knew that innovation was required in the space, as competitive products like we've just mentioned do lack Office compatibility, and some can be fairly clunky in certain aspects like authentication and so on. So Microsoft, being Microsoft, introduced Azure Virtual Desktop a few years ago, which, just to avoid confusion, was called Windows Virtual Desktop up until, time flies, up until maybe around about a year ago or so, before the rebrand, just in case you are confused. But the honest truth from my perspective is that I was expecting the growth of AVD to be fairly aggressive naturally anyway, but nowhere near as exponential as it has been. And I mean, of course, this is, it's been somewhat accelerated by COVID, with businesses now working primarily from home and IT admins ditching their on-prem infrastructure. But the product, from my perspective, adds huge value to their product stack. And I'm going to say it a couple of times, but I do also believe it's superior to its competitors as well. Okay. But yeah, just to cover off kind of what's on screen before I move on. As you can see, I've included user cases that Azure Virtual Desktop is typically tailored towards, although there are a few others as well. So businesses that are bound by strict regulations and security standards, financial services, organizations, healthcare practices, and so on. Businesses that require elasticity as a result of potentially a merger, contractors or partner access. So potentially you have contractors which are infrequently or frequently rotating in the business, giving them access on and off. Specific employees, so like bring your own device and branch workers, and also specialized workers as well, so like design and engineering, legacy applications. So potentially you're an organization that uses pretty resource heavy applications, so potentially AutoCAD or something along those lines. Being able to utilize a virtual desktop solution from any device and have access to a very high performing machine at the flick of a switch, and being able to turn that off once you're finished with it, and again, reducing costs, is a huge benefit. Okay. So I used to kind of struggle when people used to ask me what Azure Virtual Desktop is, because they used to say, give me the elevator pitch, and then I'd go off on a bit of a tangent for half an hour talking about the pros and cons and so on and so on. But I've managed to condense kind of a sentence that generally explains what Azure Virtual Desktop is. So from my perspective, it's a stack of Azure technologies that enable users to stream a personalized Windows desktop or individual applications remotely from anywhere on any device. Okay, and when I say any device, I mean pretty much any device that you can think of, assuming that you have an internet connection. It's the way what I would compare it is, for those that are non-technical, would be, let's say Netflix, for example. You have an overarching login, and you can access that from pretty much any device, right? So your smart TV, your iPhone, your iPad. Yeah, kind of Apple swayed from a hardware perspective, personal anyway, but yeah, Android tablets and so on and so on. So here is an overview of the Azure Virtual Desktop backbone and what it looks like from kind of an architectural perspective. So for those that are technical on the call, pay attention to what is controlled and managed by you as the admin, and what is controlled and managed by Microsoft. Okay. So again, for those that are technically minded, you'll be aware of the components that are required for like a typical RDS solution, such as like your broker, your gateway, diagnostics, and so on. And not to mention everything else, like your CALs and so on. But with AVD, Microsoft manages the majority of the underlying infrastructure, as it is primarily an as a service solution. Okay. So not only does this make the deployment and the management much more streamlined, but it also can reduce cost. Okay. So not only in terms of, the infrastructure itself, but also the manpower required alongside that to, patch, maintain, and update any of the infrastructure that you have as well. So there's much more to it than just the infrastructure components itself. Okay. So when we look at what is required from you as the end user to manage, you've got the desktops themselves, you've got the remote apps themselves, but also the images, your identity solution. So whether that's Azure Active Directory or domain controllers or Azure Active Directory domain services. And also alongside that, your resource and your subscription policies. Okay. Outside of what you can see on screen, there's obviously the requirement to manage your licenses to access Azure Virtual Desktop. So maybe your M365 Business Premium license, for example. But that's pretty much it. Azure Virtual Desktop is built for simplicity from the ground up. From the licensing components that we've just spoken about, having to have one license to a user instead of a ton of different user CALs and server CALs and so on and so on. along with the deployment and the management of the solution as well. Okay, which is something that can't be said for traditional solutions. Okay, and on a side note, this is an Azure only solution. Okay, so all of this is deployed and managed, maintained, updated within Azure itself, unless you were to use a third-party deployment and management tool, which ultimately just APIs into the Azure portal anyway. But for AVD itself, all of the technical components run solely in Azure. So, we've spoken about the components. Obviously, you're going to need a subscription as well, or multiple subscriptions, depending on how you design your solution. But yeah, it's not going to be as simple as something like Windows 365, but it's probably the most straightforward solution that you're going to see or build or manage or maintain from a virtual desktop perspective. Okay. So moving on to the benefits, and I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but I've picked out a few that I think are kind of more relevant for end users. Okay, so we've already discussed how AVD is built for simplicity. We've already discussed how it's built for simplicity, but let's go a little bit deeper than that. So the ones I've picked out are kind of best-in-class user experience, reduced costs, enhanced security, and remote working. So for user experience, the analogy I always give is that, I think you'd probably agree with me, and I say that we live in a consumer world now, and the consumer world is simply about everything just working right. So when I purchase something on Amazon, I want to be able to select the product I want to buy, to check out my basket within 2, maximum kind of 3 clicks, and for it to arrive at my door the following day. It works, and I enjoy the experience because it's what I've been accustomed to. The point I'm trying to make is that Azure Virtual Desktop makes this familiar experience possible, and it's possible because the experience users receive is identical to the experience that they receive on their own personal Windows devices at home, or in the office, at the local coffee shop, wherever you are. All right. So even multi-session as well, it's fully native Windows, unlike Windows experiences that we've had in the past. The compatibility you receive via Azure Virtual Desktop is a mirror image of what your users are familiar to locally. And the one that all SMB customers are always interested in is the reduced cost side of things, which I'm going to talk about a bit later on. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but as a side note, Azure Virtual Desktop is an Azure only solution. So you're only going to pay for what you use, unless you commit as part of an optimization. But again, we'll cover this off in a bit more detail later on. But yeah, only pay for what you use. You're not having to pay upfront for large pieces of hardware. You're only going to consume and pay for what your end users are using. From a security perspective, and again, I'm going to talk about this in a bit more detail later on, so I won't go into too much detail right now. But as we move through the session, I think it's important to remember that although Microsoft aren't a security specific vendor, they do invest over $1 billion every single year on cybersecurity, and they employ over 3,500 security experts that are completely dedicated to your data security and privacy. And Azure itself as a portal has more compliance certifications than any other cloud provider. So you're already likely in safer hands than the large proportion of the so-called security vendors as such. And finally, in the living today of COVID-19 and working from home, working remotely, working from anywhere, with AVD, you now have the ability to access, remote apps or fully native Windows desktops, even multi-session from anywhere on any device. So yeah, as I touched on, kind of mobile phones, Raspberry Pis, Tesla browsers, whatever you name it, anything with an internet connection, you can access Azure Virtual Desktop through. And if you'd like to know anything more about the benefits, obviously this is just a kind of select few. If you want to have a conversation around GPU requirements or anything alongside this, just reach out to Computer World and they'll be more than happy to help. So we spoke about familiarity and usability on the last slide, and I just wanted to pop this slide in here before we kind of talk about the technical benefits. So without showing you a live how to connect to Azure Virtual Desktop, this is a screenshot of the HTML client. Looks identical to what you receive on the local client as well. As we can see on screen here, I'm just going to use the laser pointer. We have a session host. Okay, so this would be what your user would click into, and then they'd then be presented with their desktop. Now, you could have multiple session hosts along here. What you could also have is remote applications. So let's say you just wanted to publish like Microsoft Word or something, for example, or Notepad. Not only would you have your session host, but you'd also have your individual remote apps as well. Okay, you'd click onto that, authenticate with your 365 credentials, and away you go. So the experience that users receive from this standpoint, very, very easy, very, very straightforward. And then once they're into the session host or once they're into the application, the experience that they're then going to receive is identical to, as we've said, what they currently experience locally at home. Okay. Yeah, so moving on to the technical benefits, and I've picked out just two for the sake of this session. So those being multi-session Windows OS and FSLogix profile containers, but there's obviously a hell of a lot more as well. And we're going to touch on a few of them later anyway. So yeah, from a security standpoint and so on, we'll touch on that. But multi-session OS and FSLogix profile containers for now. So we've already touched on multi-session and how it's fully compatible and provides user familiarity. But in terms of the other benefits that it offers, the big one is, especially for SMBs, again, is always going to be how cost effective it is, especially when it's optimized correctly. Multi-session essentially means having the ability to fit more users on a session host instead of kind of a one-to-one scenario. And given that the mathematics are fairly simple, I would say. So with multi-session, you have less VMs, and less VMs means less compute costs, considering that compute is one of the largest, if not the largest cost in Azure from a consumption perspective as well. So unless you have very specific requirements for, single session hosts or GPU requirements or administrative requirements, multi-session is always typically going to be the way to go, and is always going to be the recommendation, especially for kind of general office workers. But what you might find anyway is that you'd have a mix. So if you take our business, for example, we have, like sales, marketing, product support, and so on and so on. You might find that you would have a collection of users sitting within a host pool that utilize, say, multi-session. And then you might have, like we have, a team of developers, an analytics department, and so on and so on. And actually sitting within that marketing department, we have designers that use specific applications and video technology and so on and so on, in which case you might have segmentation within your organization concerning users. But again, we're going to touch on that a bit later on anyway. And lastly, on the multi-session piece, so running Office in Azure Virtual Desktop is completely seamless, thanks to the Office and Windows teams at Microsoft. So they collaboratively put a lot of work into optimizing 365 for virtual desktops, and I think it's fair to say they've achieved what they set out to. OneDrive works seamlessly, and also Teams, and with the video and audio direction as part of that as well. But before we move on to kind of FSLogix, and whilst we're on the subject of multi-session, I think it's a good time to discuss Horizon and Citrix and where that all kind of fits into this, which, they all kind of offer the same basic functionality, the ability to host desktop environments in the cloud, but there are a few nuanced differences and important ways as well. So, Horizon can be hosted on any major public cloud, whereas Citrix cloud desktops and AVD are hosted in Azure. Well, Citrix's other VDI solutions can be deployed on other public clouds, but its fully managed cloud desktop solution runs solely in Azure. But currently, Azure Virtual Desktop supports the multi-session. And as far as I'm aware, competitors don't currently offer this solution. Obviously, they can connect and share a virtual machine, but not concurrently. So it's worth having a look at all the different solutions, but I mean, from my personal experience and my testing and so on, I found that Azure Virtual Desktop is now with the developments that they've made, in my opinion, again, a superior product. FS Logics. So in 2018, Microsoft acquired them. They were a business called FS Logics. I'm sure the majority of you are familiar with it, to incorporate into their Azure Virtual Desktop solution, or what was called Windows Virtual Desktop at the time. But what people don't know is there's actually 4 products that consist in that solution. So you have the profile containerization solution, Office containers, application masking, and Java version controls. But for the sake of this webinar, we'll just focus on profile containers, or I might go off on a bit of a tangent. So how do they work with Azure Virtual Desktop itself? So you're probably familiar with UPDs or user profile disks if you're technical. If you're not, they're traditionally used in like RDSH servers for user setting persistence and RDS environments. But essentially with FS Logics, UPDs are no longer required. Instead, FS Logics puts all the user profile information into containers and attaches and detaches the information every time the user logs in and out, which sounds great, but this also comes with a lot of advantages as well. So like speeding up the connectivity process, eliminating the corruption of user profiles and caching OST files with emails, tasks, and calendar entries as well. And not only this, but you also have like seamless customization to your desktop itself. So, going back to the familiarity piece, your users will have the ability to customize their desktop how they want. They can change their background, they can change their file structure, and so on and so on. And you can sync up and down to OneDrive. Fantastic solution, and fits really, really well into the AVD suite. The example I always give is kind of a doctor working in a hospital, for example. If you've seen a doctor walking around from different suite to different suite, they'll have typically a computer maybe outside of each bay. They'll log in, log out, and then log in, log out at the next one as they move down the hall. The experience that they receive and the interface that they receive is exactly the same on every single device that they then go to. Okay, and it's super, super fast, very little delay, just works really, really well as a result of this solution. And it doesn't cost anything either. FS Logics is part of the Azure Virtual Desktop suite, so you don't pay extra for FS Logics as a product. It's part of the storage solution that you would include in it. So you'd pay for Azure storage, but in terms of FS Logics itself, it's included in the product suite. So I included a security slide on here, as this is obviously a big focus for most organizations, and is for Microsoft and is for us and Computer World as well. So I just wanted to go over a few kind of baseline discussions that I have with customers and topics that I typically have around Azure Virtual Desktop. So I think there's 4 or 5, which I'm just going to cover off. So number 1 being managing identity and devices. Okay, so users will always sign into their AVD sessions using their Azure AD credentials. So it's vital that you protect this identity. You'll also need to consider which devices they'll be using to connect to their sessions, so their virtual machines, their desktops, or their applications. And you can protect your users' IDs and control the devices they can use to access the virtual desktops in 2 ways. So by enabling MFA for users in Azure AD, and then by using conditional access to apply MFA for the client itself. This vitally important and will mitigate risk and significantly improve your overall security posture in Azure. Number 2, so protecting the session host virtual machines themselves from external threats, which is often something which is missed. So having protected the identity of the users in the previous point, it's important to protect the session hosts themselves. Okay, so the OS, the applications, and the network. So to do this, you'd use NSGs, so network security groups and firewalls. NSGs themselves, or network security groups, apologies for the abbreviations, are free and are simply an access control list. They're not intelligent like a firewall. However, if you need application rules and web filtering and so on, you can configure all the AVD traffic to go through a firewall using a route table. This could be your own on-premise firewall if you're connecting to Azure via a VPN or a virtual network compliance. Or it could be a third-party solution that's available in, say, like Azure Marketplace, for example. Okay. Third point is addressing your organization's data security. And a very important point there. So it's vital to consider the company data that your users are able to access via their virtual desktop sessions and whether this is ultimately secure, right? So you can protect this data from being copied or transferred to local devices. And you can also disable any features that could result in a data compromise. So this can be done using access controls and RDP properties in the host pool. So to external devices like USB drives, or even to prevent screenshots. And then lastly is monitoring Azure Virtual Desktop security on an ongoing basis. Okay, so what you have in Azure is a number of native tools. So you have Azure Monitor, Azure Security Center, and so on. Now, they don't cost anything. Again, like we spoke about with FS Logics, they're included in Azure as a product. Azure Security Center will provide a unified management platform to secure all of your Azure resources, including Azure Virtual Desktop. But also you have the monitor piece and audit logs, which will help identify any issues in the infrastructure. So application maps, network latency, any potential security threats or authentication errors. So yeah, you have to enable them when you jump into Azure, but that would be part of kind of the landing zone piece, and that's a topic for another day. But essentially, before you go building and releasing any Azure Virtual Desktop resources, you would want to consider how your Azure environment is set up beforehand, and enabling and setting up all of these solutions as part of that process. So the good news is that you're likely already eligible for Azure Virtual Desktop. So we've already spoken about how there's often a single license required, as opposed to having multiple server CALs, user CALs, and everything else that goes with the traditional VDI environment. With Azure Virtual Desktop, your user would simply just need one license. So the hero SKU, as we like to call it, is M365 Business Premium, which gives you the best kind of bang for buck, is the slang term, in terms of what's included in that SKU from a security standpoint, Office standpoint, 365 standpoint, but also the Azure Virtual Desktop standpoint as well. And obviously you've got the list here of all of the licenses that you'd be eligible. I'm not going to read them off one by one, but often partners and customers won't know that they're even eligible for this. They think they need a whole host of licenses to be able to enable Azure Virtual Desktop. In some scenarios, we often see customers bring down their licenses. So they'll go from something like a 365 E5 or E3 potentially down to a Business Premium because of what's included and giving you the Azure Virtual Desktop access as well. So yeah, something to consider. Something else you'll also need to consider is even if a user is accessing Azure Virtual Desktop once a month, they would still need the relevant license. So the license would be assigned to the individual user that would be accessing Azure Virtual Desktop as a product suite. Okay. So yeah, you could have the breakdown of users in your organization that don't access the virtual desktop environment, but those that do, potentially they're just using remote apps, for example, and some don't need that. For those that would, you would assign the relevant licenses to them. However, everybody else could stay on a potentially lower license. And from a pricing perspective, so the primary components that you need to consider for Azure Virtual Desktop are your compute. So whether you're hosting an identity solution in Azure, potentially you've got domain controllers, you need to pay for that. Your session hosts themselves, so the compute which is going to be in the host pools, the session hosts for Azure Virtual Desktop would need to be considered. Your networking components and also the licensing. This can all be paid for on a pay-as-you-go basis. Absolutely fine. However, when we're architecting, designing, and building out solutions for partners and customers, and this is something that Computer World do as well, is we look at the kind of optimization piece. Okay, so we look at auto scaling. So when we look at users, we look at different regions. So are all of your offices based in the UK, or are they potentially based overseas as well? How many of those users are accessing the environment during the core working day? How many of them are accessing the environment outside of core working hours? Is the environment just going to be on 9 to 5? If so, can you power it down during the evening and then have it restart in the morning? Or if you do have users which need access outside of core working hours, could you run the majority of the compute during the day and then reduce that in the evening and potentially just have maybe one virtual machine which is committed to Microsoft for an extended period of time, thus receiving large discounts and having your users access that outside of core working hours? All a possibility. Again, we've touched on multi-session as an OS. You could go down the route of having single session, but ultimately you're going to be paying for more compute. So using multi-session where necessary to again bring down those costs. And the annual and triannual commitments, which we've already mentioned. So you might have a virtual machine which you enable in your environment, potentially for a domain controller or for the out-of-hours session host. There's no point in paying for this on a pay-as-you-go basis because you'll be paying more than you need to, essentially. If you commit to Microsoft for a certain period of time, that's not a fixed percentage. It varies via virtual machine, but typically for, say, a 1-year commitment, you might receive potentially a 40% discount on the RRP cost, and a triannual commitment, kind of 70, 60, 80% I've seen. So yeah, worth considering, and yeah, having a conversation with your MSP who are astute in Azure pricing, like ComputerWorld, will be able to guide you in the right direction to what's going to be suitable for you, how you can bring costs down, and so on. Okay, so now we've looked at Azure Virtual Desktop as a solution, pricing, if you're eligible, security, and so on. There's 5 or 6 slides following this regarding key considerations in getting started. So this isn't going to be a full scoping piece. This is just going to kind of entice you into thinking more about Azure Virtual Desktop, and if you're intending on deploying the solution, what you should and what you could be thinking about before you go ahead deploying anything. So questions to ask yourselves as a business. Okay, so your goal. So ultimately, what do you want to achieve as a business as a result of deploying Azure Virtual Desktop, and how is it different to what you're currently doing now? We ask this as moving to Azure or the cloud in general is a very, very good opportunity to innovate and modernize. Okay, so do you just want to recreate what your current solution looks like in Azure, or could you improve on what you currently have in place in areas such as performance, security, integration, usability, and so on? Just to give you an example, if you've got a database potentially that you need to move to Azure, the majority of partners and customers will have like a SQL database, for example, on premise. Well, in Azure, you have as a service solutions for SQL, so like Azure SQL Database and so on. This is a good opportunity to explore those solutions, what they can potentially offer you as a business, and how to incorporate that into an Azure Virtual Desktop or just an Azure solution in general. Moving is always a good time to modernize, or move and then look to modernize once you're comfortable with what is in place in Azure. Outside of that, we've got how do our current employees work, and what will Azure Virtual Desktop solve, and where will it enhance our current solution? Okay, what does our current on-premise estate look like? Do you have an inventory list made up? Do you know what the specs of your servers are, and how much of this is going to be moved to Azure? What applications should your solution run? Could you run the solution using remote app streaming, or do you require full desktops for all of your users? Are you going to utilize single session, or are you going to utilize multi-session? Have you looked at what your user requirements are? How many users are actually going to be using the VDI environment? And what is the breakdown of application usage across your current employees? And what licenses do your employees currently have, as we've already touched on? How many sites is this going to be across? Is it going to be multi-region? Are you going to have multiple host pools in different regions across the globe? Or is everybody going to connect back to potentially one site? Or is it just one site in the UK? And there's so many more questions around this. So, you know, networking and connectivity, security. And if you're new to Azure, the foundations of your Azure environment, which is your landing zone, which we've kind of already touched on, having the fundamentals in place beforehand. You know, being honest with yourself as an organization, being honest with your MSP, potentially Computer World, will give you the foundations and the building blocks to put a plan in place before you then start going ahead with the deployment piece. Okay. So yeah, so the kind of one of the first considerations for me would be around compute. Okay, so we're going to touch on the kind of user profiling piece afterwards, but we've already touched on personal and pooled desktops. So just to give you a bit more information. Okay, so personal desktops, they're ideal for single session users with heavy performance requirements. So if I was looking to utilize, say, like a GPU enabled machine in Azure, for Azure Virtual Desktop, typically they don't work very well in a host pool environment with multiple users accessing that single resource. It's always best to assign individual users to that workload. Okay. CAD, SAP, BizApps, and so on. For pool desktops, they're ideal for users with light to medium workload requirements, with basic business requirements, or even medium business requirements, to be fair. And we'll touch on the light and medium piece now. So again, this comes down to the planning stage. The planning stage is very, very important from an Azure Virtual Desktop perspective. And we have conversations with partners and customers all the time around Azure Virtual Desktop environments, and they don't know what the breakdown of their current users look like. Through Computer World, you will have access to resources which will enable you to give you this breakdown. So through Inti and the Computer World partnership, there is access to, say, like solution assessments, for example, which will run on your environment, look at existing infrastructure, for example, and then provide you with the necessary information to make not even an educated guess. It will give you the information that you need to spec out an Azure Virtual Desktop environment and price up an Azure Virtual Desktop environment as well. But yeah, you can kind of indicatively do it yourselves beforehand as well. So Microsoft break users down for Azure Virtual Desktop into 4 key categories. So light, medium, heavy, and power. Medium is typically the most common. This is often a professional worker using Word, Excel, an internet browser of such. And for that user profile, from a multi-session standpoint, you could have 4 users to a virtual core. So if you've got a 16-core machine, for example, or even if you've got, let's say, wrong way around, sorry, if you've got a 4-core machine, you could have 16 users utilizing that virtual machine itself as part of that session host pool. Heavy drops down to 2 and power drops down to 1. One thing that I would say on this is that Microsoft's recommendations are typically underestimated. Okay, so when it says internet browsing, they're expecting you to have a browser open with a couple of tabs. Traditionally, that's not the way that office workers work. You'll typically have multiple tabs open. So we do tend to overspec, and the performance does tend to be greater. So typically we put people within kind of the heavy space. So 2 users to a core typically tends to be the general guideline that we work towards. So for a 4-core machine, you'd have, say, 8 users on that VM. Light users, yeah, so data entry, call center, potentially you've got a dialing system attached to your screen, you're not doing anything outside of that, light would be fine. Yeah, medium professional worker, heavy is a professional worker plus, and power is a specialist user. So yeah, CAD, Photoshop, gaming, GPU requirements, and so on. From a storage perspective, so this figure down here, 30 gig storage per user. This is when you're looking at FS Logics as a solution. Okay, so there's going to be a requirement for a per user gig allotment to consider the costs and so on. Yeah, 30 gigs is typically the estimation that we at Microsoft give for each user in that environment. So when we look at the user profile piece again, continued. So on the left-hand side here, we have our user profile, so light, medium, heavy, and power. Again, 4 users for medium, 6 users to a core for light, 2 and 1 as we move down the scale, and example virtual machines here. Okay, so for a 4-core requirement and 16 gigs, you'd be looking at, say, so like a D4 SV3 or a D4 SV4, heavy E4 SV4, F4 SV2. And then as you look at power, so again, you have the E's and the F's, but also the N series as well. Okay, and it's the N series that we wouldn't typically recommend having in a pooled environment, have them as single sessions. Yeah, so additional compute recommendations. This is something that I've put together recently, so it goes a little bit above and beyond what Microsoft have on the website. But yeah, so B series machines generally are suitable for domain controllers. D series are suitable for general purpose virtual machines. So as part of your Azure Virtual Desktop environment, if you've got any application servers or file servers or anything alongside that, D series is typically always going to be suitable, or identity solutions as well, assuming that your user count is heavy enough. E series are typically suitable for the session hosts themselves. You can utilize D series for session hosts, but we've typically found that with testing, especially for the larger enterprise environments, E series do tend to work a lot better. And N series, as we've already touched on a couple of times. Okay. Yeah, this is a screen worth screen grabbing, or when the session is sent out afterwards. Just making a note of these recommendations here is if you go onto the Microsoft website, the information that you receive tends to be a lot lighter than this. And yeah, so determining your identity solution as well. So VMs in session pools have to be domain joined. You can now domain join via Azure Active Directory. However, this is only for single session only. It isn't a limitation with multi-session, sorry, but it's more of a limitation with Azure Files itself, as it doesn't currently support Azure AD as Kerberos Realm only Active Directory. It's also only available in the ARM deployment method, not Classic, but typically everything's deployed in ARM now anyway. But in the rare occasion that you do have customers using Classic, just worth noting. So again, you've got 3 kind of typical options. So you've got using Azure Active Directory domain services, okay, which is essentially a domain controller as a service solution. So you've got 2 managed domain controllers sitting behind a Microsoft managed solution, okay. You've got spinning up domain controllers in Azure yourselves, okay, so creating 2 virtual machines, assigning them domain services and running them as domain controllers. Whether you have 1, whether you have 2 for resiliency, completely up to you. Or you can use a VPN and connect back to an on-premise environment using AD Connect and so on and so on. But all of this stuff that we're talking about are all considerations that you need to have in place before you go ahead and deploy Azure Virtual Desktop. Okay, so this is why we talk about the planning phase being so key and so vital in any Azure Virtual Desktop deployment. And whether you do that yourselves or whether you lean on the experience of ComputerWorld as your MSP, I would recommend you do so. You know, having worked with them on a number of customer opportunities, obviously they know what they're talking about, and from a landing zone perspective, but also from a scoping Azure Virtual Desktop perspective as well. Yeah, lean on your MSP as much as possible, I would say, especially if you're new to Azure and Azure Virtual Desktop. So I just wanted to include this as well. So this is kind of bringing it all together. So I know that we touched on at the very, very beginning, kind of the architectural piece and what's managed and what's not managed by Microsoft. But this just gives you an indication as to kind of an Azure Virtual Desktop environment and how that all sits together. Okay, so here we have our user connecting into the Azure environment via the front door. This is your on-premise network. Okay, so in this scenario, we've got Active Directories on-premise using AD connecting to Azure. We've got different subnets, okay, but within our primary subnet here, we have, within our primary virtual network, sorry, we have Azure Files, which is our FS Logics storage solution at the top here. And then we have 3 different host pools. Okay, it's a little bit blurred on my screen actually, but from what I looked at earlier, so you have a remote application host pool. Okay, so users that are just using the remote app functionality of Azure Virtual Desktop. You then have the single session host pool for those users that potentially have GPU requirements. We also then have our multi-session host pool for the majority of users that will be accessing the Azure Virtual Desktop environment. Okay, alongside that, we have all of our Azure native tools down here. So like Azure Security Center, Monitor, but also our Golden Image and our BCDR solutions like Azure Backup and so on. Again, fundamental to get set up as part of your Azure Virtual Desktop solution and as part of your landing zone. And then we have a continuation of our identity solution. And we can ignore this up here, but yeah, utilizing Azure AD. So yeah, just to give you an overview of what that segmentation looks like and how that architecture generally fits together. Okay. And yeah, I think that wraps up the session and what I wanted to cover today on Azure Virtual Desktop. I don't know if you wanted to add anything there, Barry.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you ever so much for that, Tom. Oh, there you go. Got a bit of an echo going on from somewhere. Yeah, thank you ever so much, Tom. A lot of information there. So hopefully those of you that attended, that's given you a good overview of what is possible with AVD, with those use cases, the things to consider, and how to build it out. Our job here at Computer World is to make this as simple and easy for you. So if you've currently got something like Citrix or Horizon, or maybe you're looking at how to deploy AVD for the first use cases, the first step would be to have a meeting with one of our specialists here at Computer World, where we can understand your use case, we can demonstrate the technology to you, we can show you some technology like things like Nerdio that we use to help make managing AVD that much simpler. So I urge you to reach out to your Computer World account manager, take those next steps. After you've looked at that, we can then look at getting a proof of concept set up. This will just give you an environment that you can play with, try your applications in, and see what would work. So thank you ever so much, Tom, for all of your efforts put in the presentation on today and going into all that detail. Thank you to everyone attended. And yeah, please reach out to either me or one of your Computer World account managers for some more information. Thank you for attending.
Thank you very much. Cheers.